Hello everyone, and welcome back. Today, I thought we would jump in to our discussion of Egyptian history, and we're going to start with the Old Kingdom today and the Third Dynasty. So the Third Dynasty is the first dynasty that most historians and people consider to be part of the Old Kingdom. There are people who consider the first dynasty to be the fourth, but most sources that I found that were like the British Museum and like .org.edu sites said that it was the third. So I'm gonna go with that. So if we recall what was happening in the last dynasty, there was a war that broke out between two different warriors who wanted to be king, and the person that settled this and actually became king was someone called Necherket, and Djoser, it's like DJ, so I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, but that was like what people called him. And Netkerket was his, what they call his Horus name. So this was like most dynasties are broken up because of a lot of different things, and one of them is like families that rule, and another one is within those families, usually it's like one specific god that they've been worshiping more, or like one main god that they have, and Horus was that main god during this time, during the Third Dynasty. Let's write this guy's name out. This is his Horus name. Necherket. Or Djoser, Djoser. The dates for these are like so all over the place. I'm getting all kinds of like different dates for when this guy reigned. I know he reigned for over 20 years. He was like the main ruler that people remembered from this period. I'm gonna go with one source. I know it's in like the 2600s for sure, but some of them say like 2620, 2640. Like the dates kind of like vary a little bit. I guess it's, I mean, I don't know why that's the case, but these are like trusted scholarly sources. So that was something that I found like interesting. I'm just gonna pick one. I'm gonna say Djoser is famous for creating the first known structures in Egypt, the first known pyramid and funerary complex. So this is at Saqqara. And it's and the first step pyramid is in the center of that. So, I will do a separate video about like structures and pyramids. Definitely pyramids, kind of like how they think they were built, what they were for, what they look like inside, and kind of like a timeline of which ones were built from beginning to end. So I won't go too much into this, but I will say that it had multiple cult buildings, and we know that they had like what they call cults, like the cult of Osiris, the cult of Horus, those kinds of things. And so these were probably Horus related. And they also had a series of underground apartments. Like, what's going on here? When he was deceased, this aligned him with the circumpolar stars and the gods associated with those stars. So. Oops. He also had a lot of military like conquests and expansion. So, a lot of people actually tend to think that he reigned for longer than this, closer to like 30 years, because of all the things that they think he accomplished. You know, it's hard to get specific dates when you're looking at things that are thousands and thousands of years ago. It's just a little bit harder to kind of solidify those dates with what the information that you have. So, yeah, they think that maybe it was a longer time than this, because this is only like 19 years right here. I'm pretty sure it's longer than that. So, kind of during this time, we talked about mastabas, I believe, in the last lesson. But they're kind of like mud brick, they're rectangular structures. They call them superstructures. This kind of started being like a thing. They started making temples and things a little bit more like extravagant and larger. So they would put like offering niches into these where you could put like foods and, you know, incense and things like that. And they moved from niches to kind of like little openings where there was almost like a little spot where you could kneel or sit, or it was like big enough for a person to like stand in. So kind of like small chapels. So I guess in like these smaller chapels there was a kind of a scene, an offering scene, I believe is what they call it, and it was the deceased person who had the chapel, whose like tomb it was, and it had a plate of bread in front of them. And usually it would have a list of other foods and like provisions, and it would kind of be like an eternal offering, I guess. So this is probably a name that you'll recognize also because it's the mummy in the mummy. But the architect who designed the pyramid at the Saqqara complex, or necropolis as they call it too, which I think is interesting, is Imhotep. So he's the first known architect, maybe ever, but definitely in Egypt. He also plays a huge role in the history of medicine in Egypt. Very important guy. And all they really know is that he existed around the 26th century, which is what we're dealing with here, kind of like a generalized, like we're not just 100% sure exact dates sometimes. So these like apartments that they had, they say there was a complex of over 400 rooms. Obviously, there's a lot of information about this because it was like the first pyramid, and it was a really important stepping stone kind of into the history of architecture and pyramids in Egypt. So it's kind of a big deal. This was built right outside of Memphis, is what they say, whereas the Saqqara complex is. I believe Memphis was the city, the place that Djoser lived. They also believe that in this complex could have been like life-size statues of his family. And there was a statue, a huge statue of Djoser sitting on his throne. Not even life-size, they would be like bigger than life-size, and his was enormous on his throne. After researching this a little bit, it's interesting. I think they might be using this kind of as the city in the Mummy. It's called Hamunaptra, I think. Obviously, they made that up. There's no like city of the dead, but the Saqqara complex has actually been referred to as a vast like complex of the dead, or like city of the dead, because there's all these empty buildings and buildings for like his staff and like family members. And I just think maybe like it's interesting that it's called the city of the dead, and Imhotep is the architect. In the Mummy, he was a priest for the pharaoh. He like fell in love with the pharaoh's daughter. Pretty sure that's what happened. It's been a little while. I do love that movie, but so maybe that's like an interesting connection that they used for the movie. There's a wall around this complex, and it's over a mile long. So is this, yeah, we can just do it down here. Most of the people who believe that the Old Kingdom began with the Third Dynasty, like these structures, this pyramid, and this like kind of boom in architectural construction, kind of defines this period, the beginning of this period, and that's why people include the Third Dynasty, because they think it's like such a drastic like step difference. I think I would probably agree. People who say that the Third Dynasty should be considered part of the early pre-dynastic period is because of their cultural and religious practices, how they kind of like tie in with early times still, and also their building practices, like how they actually make buildings, kind of like the mastabas, because they actually did that in the pre-dynastic early period. So yeah, those are the arguments, and I mean those are really the only things that allow a debate to be had for where this dynasty lies in the Old Kingdom, or not, or before that. The reason I would argue specifically that this should be included in the Old Kingdom is because the methods that Djoser used to build his pyramid would be used for the next 2,000 years building pyramids in Egypt. It was kind of like the difference that kind of like really made that change because before, I mean, his plan really was just to take a bunch of like mastabas and like stack them up upon each other. But mastabas are made with mud bricks. And instead of using mud bricks, he decided to use stone. And that was the difference. And I think because he decided to use stone for his step pyramid, that that was like the big, really big change that kind of sparked this whole crazy pyramid building extravaganza. I think that I would also make an argument that for this time, the religious practices were actually changing away from the old practices, which to me would give it more credibility inside the Old Kingdom than outside of it. And this is because building this religious complex and this huge step pyramid and this grand kind of like manor and all these buildings and this wall around it, it's kind of like a sanctuary for your soul. And you know, later they kind of solidify their belief that there are different parts to the soul and that one of them can like leave. We've talked about that in like the afterlife process videos, and kind of that one of them can like move about the complex. And this kind of solidified that idea by providing a space for those different kinds of the soul to be able to exist. That also, you know, those kinds of things come along with kind of like settling down as a civilization, not like moving around as much, kind of like putting roots in. So this had a lot to do with kind of like finding a place, building a space that's more like permanent, and also like allowing the soul to be able to have a place to go when it like separates or is expressed in like those different ways. Like it can, you know, different parts of the soul. It's very, very complicated and in depth, but I think for the most part, I kind of get what they were going for. Obviously, I'm not an ancient Egyptian, so I'll never really get it. So the next pharaoh we're going to talk about is Sekhmet. Sekhemket. This was the next pharaoh of Egypt, and he was either Djoser's son or brother. He ruled for less than 10 years. Sekhemket is most well known for what they call the buried pyramid. This exists at the Saqqara complex, and they call it that because when they found it, it was buried under the sand. Oops. In the present day, there's been evidence found that this perhaps was not built for Sekhemket, and it was built for his wife. Whose name is let me make sure that's right. Jesseretnabi. He continued his policies, Djoser's policies, and that also meant he continued his military expansion. And kind of, which also includes the expansion of like arts, architecture, and kind of like cultural practices. So he kind of continued that after his father or brother, you know, whoever he was. It's the whole mystery of it. I'm just gonna give the general year of 2650. So he ruled for, again, he ruled for less than 10 years, so it's sometime around there. The next pharaoh, his name is Kaba. We're going to say 2640. So actually not a lot is known about him, even kind of like his relation to the last king. They do know that he built a pyramid. It's called the Layer Pyramid. This was it, like had a surrounding complex with it. It was near Giza. The town was called Zayat El Aryan. So that's really all they know about this guy. Not a whole lot, Kaba. There are, you know, I did find a few like sources about other pharaohs that have kind of like ruled in between, but like no information is known about them. They're not even 100% sure who's where or if they were actually pharaohs, some of them, any of the dates. So these are the ones that most scholars agree on, kind of like similar, like the order. Although there has been debate about some people like being before Kaba, or like I think there's suspected a couple people after him before this next person. But for instance, Nebka is a pharaoh that's thought to be after Kaba, but we don't know how he's related. We also don't know how long he reigned, if he actually reigned after him, probably, but who really knows? The last person that we really kind of know about is named Huni. So Huni is the last pharaoh that ruled in the third dynasty. So we know that he ruled in the third dynasty. We know he was the last pharaoh. We don't know almost anything about him. People thought he built the medium pyramid for a while, but they've now debunked that, and there's evidence that it was built by, I think it's Snefru. I think that's his name, but he's in the fourth dynasty. And they believe that, I mean, nothing really changed. There's no evidence that he disrupted any cultural or religious practices. Like, things just kind of like stayed the way they were. Many think that this is where the Old Kingdom begins. I actually do not, especially after doing this lesson. I don't think so. I think it probably begins with the third dynasty. And again, you know, they just know that he ruled until the next pharaoh in the beginning of the fourth dynasty. And they know that there was no real like deconstruction of policies. There was no like change in military, no change in like artistic or cultural like spread of practices or anything like that. So they just really think he like kind of kept a steady hand on things for a while until the fourth dynasty began. You know, when we get into later dynasties, there will be more and more information because, you know, the further back you go, the less information, evidence, cultural materials exist for you to actually like base any kind of like evidence or information on. Facts. It's hard to find facts. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this lesson, and I will see you in the next one.